dear guests and colleagues, very nice to have you here. Welcome to another colloquium of the Center for Theories in Historical Research. I never know if I translated the name of the center in the English version very correctly. Very kind that you have found the way here, also in this unusual Wednesday evening time. Usually this event takes place on Fridays, but this Friday, well, it's another story. Good to have you here to listen to Carolyn Steedman speaking on poetry for historians. Carolyn, we are very grateful, very grateful that you have accepted our invitation, which was initiated by Lev Gehadas and Martina Kessel. They also can't be here tonight. And they are very sorry for that. It's my fault when I scheduled this event. But it's very nice to have you here in Bielefeld. Let me say a few words what you can expect when meeting Carolyn Steedman. I don't want to tell you everything about her entire life, which might bore you because it's so long, because she was so active. So I try to figure out what she stands for and how she works, and I do it in. I try to imitate her style a little bit, and yeah, and I have an image for that. Maybe you don't see it very well. I was very much thinking about, and I was very nervous about how I could introduce such an honorable guest. Last night I had a hopefully great idea. It was just a few days that my little children have experienced a very irritating and fascinating phenomenon. I have a more dramatic image for you. Dust in a light ray. They have seen it for the very first time in their life. They were very fascinated when they were seeing suddenly there is something in the air which they usually don't experience, and they experienced for the first time. They were somehow frightened, fascinated, and delighted what they saw. In this circumstance of light shining into a dark room, something becomes visible what is usually hidden to our eye. All these dancing particles, all these hidden small materials which is omnipresent but still invisible, which only by some special method and in some special moment can be experienced and become a widening of our ways of perceiving the world. This all I saw somehow in my little children staring on what they saw, and I have an image, not exactly of the situation, but of this situation. Carolyn has used this metaphor of dust in one of her very famous books, which came out in 2001, if I'm informed correctly. I have the library copy here. To reflect, she used this metaphor of dust to reflect on the character of history, on its methods and on matters, on its limits and desires, on the history of historical writing in general. Like dust, history is always present, but not always visible. The way it is made visible and it is used is a certain development of the 19th century, which has not necessarily been done in the way we are doing it now. All this Carolyn has made visible and laid out with the metaphor of dust. She called the book Dust, but it's generally about history. This is a way how she often works. She takes something of the word which of the world which you can experience, and takes it as a metaphor, and it brings it into reflection on something more general. This is how Carolyn Steedman works, just in much finer words than I am able to do so. Carolyn has graduated from the University of Sussex in 1968. She earned a master's degree from Newnham College in Cambridge in 1974. After that, she worked as a teacher. The kids must have loved your sense of humor, I guess. In 1982, Carolyn started an academic career at the University of London, and then she became senior lecturer at the University of Warwick in 1988, reader in 1991, professor in 1995. Everything correct?
I think so.
So far. I took this from the Luxembourg version of Wikipedia, because this is the most longest article on it. Very strange to read. She has published, I counted 15 books. You said today 13. I think there were new editions of some.
Oh, yes.
Numerous articles, mainly on social and cultural history, on childhood and everyday life, on oppression and on census, on power and resistance, many topics. By the way, the dust image, the dust and light in the image I have shown you here is created artificially.
Oh.
With the help of a computer application. So there's a normal image and there's put the dust over it. How does this change the metaphor of dust and history? Throughout her whole work, Carolyn asks questions like this. Place with the unexpected, the in-between or the unfitting. One of her most discussed books, Landscape for a Good Woman. I have my own copy here, which I will send around as well, is the insist of a place for a specific history which does not fit into the common interpretations or histories of the English working class, as most of the individual history do not fit. Carolyn takes this as a starting point for a rigorous and engaged, a self-reflective, hard but warm analysis. As a starting point for reflections on gender theory, psychoanalysis, social sciences, in historical writing and many other things as well. So these two things, this insistence of question marks and this work with metaphors and trying to take this as a starting point for general reflections on history, this is how she works, I think, and this is also can also be found in her very last book, Poetry for Historians, which came out just a few weeks ago. We are happy to have you here, Carolyn, to have the privilege to discuss your thoughts face to face with you. Voila, Carolyn Steedman.
Thank you. Lars told me this morning that it was an honour, historically speaking, to be invited to speak at Bielefeld. And I want to tell you, he was describing the 1970s and 1980s when it was an honour to be a guest speaker at your university. And it was partly, he was telling me a joke, but I want to tell you I really do feel honoured. Thank you very much, Lars. Anyway, I am very pleased to be here, and thank you so much for asking me. Now, I changed my title very slightly from the time when I first, since I first gave it to Lars. And this happened over the past few months as Lars talked me through the purposes, meaning and history of the centre, talked me through my talk and what was wanted from me, or at least anticipated from my lecture. And Lars took to announcing himself in emails with the subject line Bielefeld calling. So whenever that appeared in my mailbox, I knew it was him, Bielefeld calling. Now, in English, that phrase, anywhere calling, London calling, alludes to the BBC World Service's station identification. This is London calling. Now, that was used during the Second World War, often in broadcasts to occupied countries. Nowadays, in the new century, the phrase has the sweet melancholy of nostalgia attached to it, not least because it became familiar to television audiences in the 1960s and 1970s from the ever-popular Dad's Army, which is a situation comedy about the Home Guard, which it's still on endless repeat on British television, and it's always shown somewhere on one of the BBC channels, and it probably will be shown into all eternity. And that's why we're familiar with the phrase somewhere calling. It's why London or anywhere, Birmingham for example, Birmingham calling has the associations of exasperated comedy. You use it in emails and telephone calls to friends to laugh at your own pretentiousness and at the eternal cycle of historical nostalgia in which we're all caught. And today, comedy is one of my points. When I was working on Poetry for Historians, already well aware that I was writing in the comic mode, I came across the English social historian George Trevelyan arguing in 1913, which amazed me, that the dignity of history, whether literary or scientific, is too often afraid of contact with the comic spirit. So I tried to learn from George Trevelyan not to be afraid of the comic. I was already doing it. And indeed, I no longer needed to be afraid of a way of writing, for I was no longer part of the British university system. I retired at the end of 2013, and I could now write, I said this to everyone, I could now write the book I had been waiting to write for 30 years. In 2014, January the 1st, I entered a state of freedom. Freedom to write about a poet and poetry in the way I wanted to write. I have to explain that apart from 2 books, one of which was my PhD thesis, and 4 articles, everything I wrote over a 35-year period was as a contracted worker in a university system operating research assessment. The first UK research assessment exercise, RAE, research assessment exercise, took place in 1986. It introduced what British government websites still call an explicit and formalised assessment of research quality at British universities. Funding depends on that assessed quality. After 1986, a further 6 research assessment exercises were conducted, the last in 2013. Of course, I stayed till the end of 2013 so that my publications could be submitted. Now, I believe that I was a nice little earner for the University of Warwick. I was as canny as everyone else about the 5-star journals and the poshest university presses. I believed I could read the history panel's mind like the back of my hand. I believed I had their number. I knew how they thought. I laughed in amazement when a sociologist told me, maybe in 2001, that if a sociologist wrote a novel, then it might be considered as part of the sociologist's output. Well, nothing like that down among the historians, said I. I did very little journalism, and I had been very mean about reviewing because those activities didn't count towards the research assessment exercise. I had written to count for nearly 40 years. Now, no one made me do this. I did it willingly, out of my own understanding. I was rather proud of my clear-eyed take on the legal situation we were all in. You don't write for yourself. You didn't write for yourself. Your publications were not submitted by you as an individual, but by a unit of assessment, that is a department. All of your colleagues, we were all in it together. A book called Poetry for Historians would not have been considered history as we know it. It could never have been submitted by my department as one of my REF outputs. Never. Now, it would not have been a question of style or to do with a way of writing. I think I did develop a style of writing which used the first person and in which I told some jokes all the way through from 1986 until 2013. I think over those years I got better at writing. That was not a problem, for I was writing about historical topics, historical material, and I was producing historical arguments. The problem with Poetry for Historians is that I was writing about poetry and reproducing poetry. Poetry and literature and their analysis belong to the realm of English studies and literature departments. They are not history. I'm speaking the British system here. And I would never have fought to get that book recognised as history. I couldn't have done that to my department or to my colleagues in any way I wouldn't have been allowed to. Now, perhaps research assessment produced a fine collegiality. But what else? Many have written about the shutting down of interdisciplinarity, the competitive, adversarial and punitive spirit evoked by the research assessment exercise has often been described. I bring you as a present an article from yesterday's Guardian newspaper, which discusses the stress that the mental stress that the research assessment exercise places many, particularly young scholars under. It is a scandal. That's a present for you. I will leave you my copy of The Guardian. The History at University's defence group, History had to form a national defence group to defend itself as a discipline against the RAE. It said that the terms of research assessment create a competitive climate between institutions as well as an artificial job market in the period immediately before each exercise. Stefan Collini, this is an article of his from the London Review of Books on the 10th of May. Stefan Collini says that everywhere he goes in Europe, he is asked, but why have they done this? He's being asked about research assessment and the general marketisation of the universities in the UK. That seems to me to be the most important historical context to what I have to say. What follows now is something to do with Poetry for Historians, with the book, and with the poet W.H. Auden as a historical thinker, or maybe not a historical thinker. It will turn out to be about Auden as not a historian, but as someone who did do history in society, which I shall come to. I'll come to history in society in a moment. What I want to say is to do with history writing as an activity, a form of labour and a cultural form. And I hope to raise questions about the political and cultural contexts to all writing, including the writing of history and the writing of poetry. Really, I want to say something about writing. By the end, if I haven't, well, you can throw me out of the window. Now, in the book, I pay a lot of attention to Auden's 1955 poem, Homage to Clio. This is a poem I have been obsessed with for 30 years. I've plundered it for epigraphs more times than I care to remember. Now, homage to Clio is Auden's homage to the Muse of History. That's the first thing it is, or pretends to be. It is the title of a poem, and it is the title of a collection of history poems. I wanted to understand this poem, which I am going to show you a little bit of almost right now. I really believed, it has 23 stanzas, it's very long, and this is just an extract from it. You don't need to read it, I just want to give you a sense of it. I thought for a very long time that this poem could tell me what kind of activity history is and what we're doing when we do history. It is long, 23 stanzas. It is written in, to get technical, it is written in the syllabic form, which is completely alien to English poetry. For English verse is like the stress-timed language that English is. English, as a language like German, is organized by stress, not by syllables, as the French language and French poetry is organized by syllables. But this is Auden's attempt to make English poetry syllabic, to organize poetry by syllables rather than stress. He, it seems, wanted to make syllabic verse a permanent resource for English language poets. Now here, as you can see, and if you can't see, I'll tell you, what the poet does is reveal the Muse of History as a blank-faced girl, completely vacuous, an empty face. She's always present when anything happens, anything at all, any time, but she has absolutely nothing to say. Now, how could you not be entranced by that paradox, that puzzle? How could you not fall in love with it? History with nothing to say. But you love for the wrong reasons, or the shape of what you love dissolves as new knowledge washes over it. You had nothing to say and did not, one could see, observe where you were, muse of the unique historical fact. And earlier in the poem, these beautiful lines, at any moment, eternally, we at haphazard and unseasonably are brought face to face by one's Clio with your silence. After that, nothing is easy. A history that does not speak, a muse of history who does not write. In the iconography of the West over the last 2,000 years, Clio has quite often been depicted with a pen in her hand. When she turned into Historia, that little emblem of history that every jobbing printer had in his shop, she invariably looked up from the book in which she was writing. Is writing not a kind of saying? Is Auden's Historia silent on the page as well as mute in her person? It seems to be the case that she is. And then, in a striking reversal of the taken for granted chronological relationship between memory and history, the poet entreats the Muse of History to teach us our recollections. Now, as you know, Western historiography teaches that history, that's professional, university-based history that emerged during the long 19th century, usurped the functions of memory. The story goes at the beginning of things, Mnemosyne was the mother of all the muses, including Clio, at least according to some authorities of the ancient world. Now, modern historians seem to me to have believed the ancient authorities for the main part in giving various accounts of how history came into the world and what its relationship to memory has been over the last 300 years. You may know that Jacques Le Goff used the myth in order to begin his account of how history usurped the functions of memory, accelerating at the end of the 18th century with the development of history as a subject of inquiry in the academy, and then later as information to be imparted to whole populations in European systems of mass education. So he used the myth in giving that account of the history of history. Now, recently, if you keep up with the literature, the chronological relationship of memory to history has been less insisted on. But nevertheless, Auden's suggestion that history, or Clio, or his blank-faced girl, can teach us how to perform the everyday activity of remembering has always struck me as something to understand, or to try to understand. So for 20 years, I read Auden's fabulous and frequent musings of the post-war years as meditations on the meaning and philosophy of history. I read them as meditations on history as a made and fashioned thing, not as historians' daily activities among documents, files, and registers. I thought Auden's history poems to be about Clio, to be about history herself, asking questions about what she herself is. And it was with his Clio that I saw through the dust, history as a way of thinking and a way of writing as a cognitive and literary form. And in one modality, that book is an account of the long and painful discovery that Auden's Clio isn't history, and that she isn't there or here or anywhere. But that really was after a very, very long quest to find out where she came from. Now, in the first half of the book, I provide some really useful information for the historians I'm asking to read poetry for documentary evidence. I revisit some earlier work on 18th century domestic servants who wrote poetry, and there were a lot of them. This is so that I can discuss poetry as a form of social analysis as well as a literary form, and so that I can quietly provide my readers with a technical vocabulary that may be useful to them in reading the rest of the book. 18th century English workers made those little engines of language called poems because they wanted to and because they could. My argument is that it is at least as useful to the historian to know how a poem works as it is to know about the 18 stages of manufacture that Adam Smith said went into the making of a pin in The Wealth of Nations. We're all very keen on learning how pins were made as historians, what the workers did all day in producing goods. So my argument was that it is equally useful to know how a poem was made, how a poem works, like a stocking machine works or a weaving loom works. But the servants are useful in the book in another way. Auden once described metre and rhyme and syllables and verse structure as the poet's servants. He literally said poetic form was his servant as a poem. So the way was open, and it leads to the only biographical pages in the book to consider W.H. Auden as the product of an Edwardian, Solihull, three-servant household. Now, you're not laughing at the merest mention of Solihull, so I must provide you with this information, that in the early 20th century, Solihull was a large village on the outskirts of Birmingham, which had, and still has, a reputation as the most genteel place in the country. Now, Auden's attitude towards skivvies, servants, was not at all complicated. He expected them to be there. They'd been there in his childhood home, they'd been there at his private schools, they'd been there in his Oxford college, and they'd been there in all the filthy apartments he inhabited in New York. And they were there, domestic servants were there on the island of Ischia, where he spent his 1950s summers from all the way through the 1950s, and it's where his history poems were written, on the Italian island of Ischia. I have some very good stories about the servant he and Auden's lover, Chester Calman, employed there. But the point is that everything that made Auden a typical member of the servant-employing class was learned in childhood and adolescence. My account of him as employer and the way in which the dirt and disorder of his several transatlantic households has absolutely preoccupied all of Auden's biographers. All of that is an overture to considering the schooling that Auden experienced during his childhood and adolescence. The history and literature curriculum, as they may have been experienced by all manner of children, including upper middle class children like him, in the period 1900 to 1930. It really is time to give you Auden's dates, isn't it? You must be in need of them. 1907 to 1973, that's the period I'm talking about. What I wanted to do with this information about the history and literature curriculum during Auden's childhood was to add to current discussions of a historical education in the English 20th century and the remaking of social history into the history of everyday life and everyday things. I discussed the classics curriculum, which was pretty much put in place for elite children like W.H. Auden by the end of the 18th century. It was the same in the 18th as it was in the 20th. But all of this material in the book, all of this fascinating material about the history and literature curriculum is used to pursue that overarching question: where did Auden's Clio, in homage to Clio, where did she come from? I followed Clio through the English 18th century. She first arrived in England with translations of Herodotus in the later 17th century, and I found through these investigations that she, who was both history and poetry for the ancients, became a boring girl who simply recites what has been, who recites the history of those who are worthy to be history's subject. That was an 18th century development in England. This happened to Clio at the same time, this is the long 18th century, as the distinction between poetry and history, which had been put in place by Aristotle in the 3rd century BCE, was reanimated. So Clio went to England, if you can put it like that, at the same time as Aristotle's distinction between history and poetry was made widely available in English culture. Now, as you can see, one recent translation of Aristotle's Poetics describes the differences between poet and historian like this. I'm going to read this because I just think it's so important. The distinction between historian and poet is not in the one writing prose and the other verse. You might put the works of Herodotus into verse, and it would still be a species of history. It consists really in this, that the one describes the thing that has been, and the other a kind of thing that might be. Hence, poetry is something more philosophic and of graver import than history. So that's the comparison put in place in the English 18th century. Now, by poetry, 18th century English commentators meant usually verse, sometimes fiction. The novel, the emerging novel, the romance, was incorporated within the poetic. One of them said, the object of the poet is not to relate what has actually happened, but what may possibly happen, either with probability or from necessity, whilst the historian relates what actually has been done. That was from 1792. By the end of the English 18th century, the comparison between poetry and history was a commonplace of the magazine and educational literature. The allure of one, the extreme dullness and boringness of the other. That comparison was laid out for many readerships. Their difference, according to Aristotle, is not in the form or style, but in the very nature of things. But how so? History only paints what has happened, poetry what might have happened. For 1813 readers of the Ladies' Magazine, the provinces of history and poetry had been demarcated so clearly that the young women reading this comic verse were actually able to hear Clio being told that "'tis thine to bid us be historical and write of wars and plagues and queens and kings, not in poetic style or allegorical as the fond love muse sings, but in plain prose. Then bid me be a proser, otherwise to write history would be a poser." So many people worried away at the distinction between poetry and history for the magazine, educational, self-improvement markets. I wanted these excited 18th century discussions to add to our knowledge of how modern formal academic history came into being in one society from the end of the 18th century. Clio was also, Clio inverted commas, Clio was also a fine vehicle for discovering how history was made in society. And I'm making reference here to Jorma Kalela's argument in his book 3 years ago, Making History, in which Kalela argues that history, thinking about it, imagining it, making it an item of your identity, is done outside the academy as well as inside the academy. It's done through the common resources of education and media, and that professional card-carrying historians do history in society as much as anyone else. So this is to ask questions about how a common historical imagination is made in different times and places. These, for examples, are questions put in Alison Landsberg's recent book, Engaging the Past. This is an example of public history, as it's called in the UK. Landsberg follows history to the places where it is made outside the academy, in film and among film audiences, and in television docudrama. But she doesn't follow history's making to primary school classrooms or to poetry writing, which in my book are sites in which history is made. Now, to go back to Auden, a lot of commentary on Auden says that he abandoned the Marxist perspective that he may just have acquired in the 1930s. That after he returned to the Anglican Communion, to the Church of England, in 1940, he became a devotee of big, goal-directed, eschatological Christian history, which was first popular in the UK in the 1930s, and then again in the Atlantic world, 1950s. There are discussions about this kind of history in its intimate relationship with Cold War ideology. And Auden read a lot of it. He read a lot of this kind of history before he wrote his cycle of history poems collected together in homage to Cleo. I consider two of these in detail in the book, Homage to Cleo, obviously, and also Makers of History, which was written a month before Homage in 1955. Now, Makers of History demonstrates, to me at least, that Auden did not abandon the social history he had read, the Marxist social history he had read and maybe espoused in the 1930s. The poem proposes that Cleo loves those workers who bred them better horses, found answers to their questions, made their things. You have there are the high-ups, the elite, the employers. Cleo, in this poem, Cleo even loves the house poet, employed by the aristocratic master to record the life and loves of the great. She loves even, in that line, the fulsome bards they boarded. Fulsome, wordy poets they employed in their grand households. So they are the high-ups, the appropriators, the elite. And it seems to me that Makers of History is a marker, albeit rather an early one, of the new social history that emerged in the post-war era in the UK and across Europe. But Makers of History absolutely imposes the necessity of quoting Bertolt Brecht. The history, or Cleo, in Makers of History, is the one who actually does speak in Brecht's A Worker Reads History. The worker asks about the absence of the workers from all of her earlier tales. Now, this is the universally acknowledged and absolutely beautiful social historian's poem. It really is a creed of those who must always ask, always, who built the 7 gates of Thebes? Who actually built them? Who were the stonecutters, the masons, the hired hands who hauled the blocks of stone? Caesar conquered Gaul. Was there not even one cook in his army? Asked the poet. In my book, this beautiful poem, which I really think a social historian must say in her heart every morning, even if she doesn't know it, it is at the head, it's reproduced at the beginning of a rather cruel contrast with the poetry of E.P. Thompson, in particular the poetry of labour that the famous author of The Making of the English Working Class, the poetry of labour that he produced in the 1950s, when, according to several commentators, Thompson's primary identity was poet, not historian. The chapter at which this poem stands at the head also investigates Thompson's 1980s reading and analysis of 2 18th century plebeian poets, the field labourer and charwoman Mary Collier and the thresher Stephen Duck. And I have to tell you that E.P. Thompson does not come out of my reading very well. He demonstrates something I point to throughout the book, and that many literary critics have said, that when historians do take any notice of the written artifacts produced by poets, they are more likely to plunder them for content, for quotations to support their own argument, than they are to pay attention to them as forms of composition. In this way, it is said, we detach the content of a poem from its properties of form and genre. And, say some, this is naivety dressed up for misinterpretation. We're just asking for it. The condescension of literary scholars. I actually think the literary scholars are right, at least as far as Thompson is concerned. Because even when writing much later on, in the early 1990s, just before he died, when Thompson wrote exhilaratingly about a poet in his posthumous book on William Blake, it's called Witness to the Beast, he does not once, on my reading, discuss Blake's use of verse form, metrical structure, or stress pattern. And for all the attention Thompson paid to the form that Mary Collier, the charwoman, deliberately chose to write in, she might as well have written a letter or a little tract or an essay, not a poem. E.P. Thompson was criticised by some for his inabilities in reading poetry, but nobody criticised his writing of it, for few can have laid eyes on it before 1999 and the posthumous publication of his collected poetry. Some have thought that he perhaps found it difficult to understand what kind of thing literature was, its beingness in the world, its quiddity. But I am forced beyond form to content. My use of homage to Clio, all my pursuit of her, all my questions about where she comes from, constitutes in the end my sad acknowledgement that Auden's Clio is not history and never was history and isn't there and isn't here. And it is with that poem that I discuss Auden's Christian theology of history, or you could say history as theology. This was really very difficult to do, for I had to think about things that I had resisted thinking about since the age of 14. As a historical thinker, Auden worked within the framework of Christianity. I had not known until very recently how much there is to understand of the Christianity he returned to in the 1940s and the grand theory histories he read when he was producing this 1950s poem. I had to acknowledge that the Clio to whom he paid homage was in fact... In the 1940s, Auden read so very much grand theory of history that I had to do so as well. Now, he didn't appear to care very much for Spengler or Toynbee, which would at least have given me a foothold. The big historians he cared about were equally grand but less well known philosophers of Western history. And so my duty as a historian, I had to attempt to understand Auden as a Christian poet and a Christian philosopher of time and history. And the realization that I was actually going to have to read Eugène Rosenstock-Huess's Out of Revolution and Denise de Rougemont's Love in the Western World and all these books gave me much anxiety. It was really not knowing what kind of thing they are that troubled me. It was different with Auden's influences from Kierkegaard or even from the Confessions of St. Augustine. In 1954, just before the Homage to Clio cycle of poems was composed, Auden was reading Augustine. And Auden wrote in reviews about Augustine undertaking the first serious analysis of the experience of time. And he wrote about Augustine's distinction between natural and historical time, which he said Christianity encouraged if it did not invent. But I had been taught to read Being and Nothingness and The City of God as historical texts, as examples of Western thought, examples of cultural history. But that kind of reading would not do for Auden's Christian historiography. That reading list, and it's actually much longer, inscribes theology as historiography. And because it is theology as historiography, it is so resolutely Western, Occidental in its understanding of the past that my spirit just withered and died. I had to abandon Auden's Clio. I had been reading the wrong Clio in homage to Clio for a very long time, and I'd been doing it willfully. I had no permission from the text to make my reading. I could have worked these things out for myself 20 years ago. The Clio in homage to Clio is not history or about doing history. She is about some other form of time that isn't historical time. She is about Christian time. And I do not have the emotional or devotional ticket that will take me to the end of her line. There are other realms of historical thinking where I can get on with the job of working out how things happen, how people decide to do things, and do things when they did. A realm in which we all know that what is made out of the past depends on who's doing the observing, and that what we think about it depends on what we're actually doing, which is writing this history, some history or other, right now. And it was Auden, in his letter to Lord Byron, 1936, who inscribed for me the history that his homage to Clio is not. He is on a tour of Iceland with his friend Christopher Isherwood. They're on horseback through Iceland. He takes with him Byron's Don Juan to read. Who knows why? And whilst he's there, he writes the story of his life in a letter to the long dead Lord Byron, hence letter to Lord Byron, in which he says at one point to Lord Byron, I know the fact is really not unnerving, that what is done, that no past dies, that what we see depends on who's observing and what we think on our activities. I'll come to that funny last rhyme as I finish in 1 minute. Now, in one reading, this is a perfect rewriting of Marx's proposals at the beginning of the Critique of Political Economy, that the mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. Or, if I can paraphrase Marx, that poetry and history are things made out of the stuff of the world and our living on this earth. And Auden is recognizing this in 1936. And this is why a new love dawned. Auden was at his funniest in Letter to Lord Byron. He actually copied the Italian verse form ottava rima that Byron employed in Don Juan. Now, the 8-line stanza of ottava rima was the form employed by English-speaking satirical writers of mock heroic romances. It has a very demanding rhyme scheme which goes A, B, A, B, A, B, C, C. And it's said to have encouraged the use of comic rhyme all the way through the 18th, 19th and 20th century, which is why you have to say not our activities but our activities to rhyme with dies, which is very funny to the English ear. Believe me, Monty Python is full of this kind of mistaken rhyming. So you have to say, I know the fact is really not unnerving, that what's done is done, that no past dies, that what we see depends on who's observing, and what we think on our activities, like that. Well, you don't have to laugh out loud. But it is truly ridiculous and very funny to the English ear. And so all I can say is that I shall go on loving Auden for reasons of laughter, though he will never be able to tell me what history is and why we do it. Thank you.